Morning, everyone. I trust you are well and hope that those that were able to fasted okay yesterday. So, I would like to share with you a little thought, a little question that I'm sure we're all thinking about. And that is I can't do these headphones, I'm sorry. And that is in the aftermath of Tisha B'Av. What exactly is it all about? It seems a bit of an irrelevance, a bit abstract, mourning over something that was 2,000 years ago. If the temple hasn't been for 2,000 years, why are we still hoping and believing that it's going to come back? And one of the questions that also arises is, I guess, related to this, is the idea that we all know, we were told, brought up, don't cry over spilt milk, right, Rebecca? We're all told that. And if that's the case, it doesn't seem to fit with the idea that our sages tell us that if you mourn over the destruction of the temple, and anyone who mourns over Jerusalem, they are going to merit to see the rebuilding of Jerusalem. So how do the two fit together? On the one hand, we're very optimistic, a forward-thinking nation, and yet on the other hand, we're a nation that we're realistic. We're realistic. Why is it we seem to be living in the past? So I want to try and address this. So let me try and pull a few things together. So if it was just mourning about the past, I don't think there would be any point in what we are doing. But our sages tell us that when we actually are mourning and missing the temple, it is actually a form of building the future. Because if you recognize that there's something missing in your life, and then you work towards it, and that is the idea of the mourning period. So what exactly are we missing? Let me share with you one of my favorite stories. It's a true story. It's an event that occurred at the time of the destruction of the first temple. The Ramah in Torah Sa'olah, he quotes a very moving dialogue between Jeremiah the prophet and the Havdil, Plato, the great philosopher. And herein I think lies the understanding of our grieving over the past. So the great philosopher Plato accompanied Nebuchadnezzar up to Jerusalem. This is after the destruction of the temple. You can imagine the place is smoldering, there's mass destruction, and corpses lying everywhere. The scene must be horrendous. And Plato entered the Temple Mount, and there he sees in front of his eyes Jeremiah, who sat down and he's wailing bitterly over the destruction. Now, Plato knew that Jeremiah was a great prophet, a great philosopher, so he was surprised by the scene. And Plato addressed Jeremiah, and he asked him two questions. Why are you, a great Jewish sage, bemoaning a mere heap of rubble? And I'm sure that's a question that many of us have had. Why is it that we can't just rebuild? We've rebuilt the whole of Israel. Why don't we just go and rebuild the temple? And the second question is, the Temple Mount was already lying in ruin, right? And therefore, how does it befit a great sage to bemoan the past? So Jeremiah replied to these two questions of Plato by saying to him, surely in the course of your career, Plato, you're a great philosopher, there have been questions, conundrums that you have not been able to understand, not been able to comprehend, right? Tell me, what are the greatest philosophical concepts that you have found irresolvable in your quest for wisdom and knowledge? So Plato says, no problem, I'll share them with you, right? I am afraid that no one in the world has been capable or is capable of resolving some of these great difficulties. Jeremiah says to him, encourages him to ask them the three questions that he has, the irresolvable questions. And all of a sudden, Jeremiah, without a second's hesitation, says that he's able to resolve all the questions, these irresolvable questions that Plato had. Plato is just bowled over. He's astounded. Yeah. How is it possible? He said, I'm a great philosopher. I know you're a great philosopher, but where did you get that wisdom to be able to, to comprehend and to resolve these great philosophical conundrums that the whole of my life I haven't been able to resolve? And Jeremiah said, the answer to those questions doesn't come from me. It comes from what used to reside in those bricks and mortar, the divine presence. And with that, Plato sat down next to Jeremiah and also cried. What we see from the crying of Jeremiah is that it wasn't a crying over the past. It was a crying over the present, over the fact that the divine presence wasn't amongst the Jewish people. When we look around the world today and we see all the pain and sorrow and so much stuff that's going on, so much anguish, so much disharmony and strife in the world, in our people, in our families. And we ask ourselves, where does all this come from? And the answer is, the truth is that it all comes from what used to reside in the temple. And that is the divine presence. When God's presence was dwelling amongst us at the time of the temple, there was peace, tranquility, there was a transparency, and there was truth reigning in the world. We lived in a very different world. And that, of course, is the answer to those two questions. It's not a crying over the past, it's a crying over the present with a view and an aim to the future. And it's interesting, as Rabbi Sachs, in one of his last addresses on Tisha B'Av last year, he spoke about the fact that if you look at the prophets, you'll look at Jeremiah, Isaiah, you'll see that all of them seem paradoxical. They start out with prophecies of doom and gloom about the destruction, about the exile of the Jewish people, and all the terrible tragedies that were going to befall the nation. As you go on, and sometimes in the case of Jeremiah, Isaiah, I think it's only in chapter 2, straight afterwards, you find that the prophets are also, the very same prophets of doom are the prophets of hope. The prophets that are full of optimism for the redeeming and the rebuilding of the temple and the returning of the people to Jerusalem, to Israel. How can that be? How can that be? Good morning, everyone. How can it be that the very same person that 2 seconds ago was full of doom and gloom, and 2 seconds later is now full of hope and faith and optimism for the future? The answer is, of course, that their hope and faith was in the Jewish people, because it's really all in our hands. It's up to us. We have the ability, the capability to be able to transform these days, as the prophet says, miyagon lesimcha, from days of sorrow to joy. So how do we do it? So there are, of course, as we've discussed over the last few days, there are many things that wrong with the world and with the Jewish people and with our lives in particular. But let me share with you one story, amusing story. I don't think I've told it in this context, although I did tell it in shul. Ramosha Green, he's a rabbi in Shah Yoshev Yeshiva in America, and he tells a very amusing and inspiring story. So he was driving in New York City, and all of a sudden he felt something pop, and he hit a pothole, and his car, of course, slows down, and he realizes he's got to pull over to the side of the road. He pulls over, and he calls what in America they have RAA, is the AAA, and he sat back and he waited for someone to come to help. After about half an hour, a Latino man arrives in his 60s, pulls up, introduces himself as Donnie, and without warning started speaking to this rabbi in Yiddish. "Are you Jewish?" I asked, said Rav Doni. He shook his head with a smile and said, "No, I'm not Jewish." I laughed and then asked him, says Rav Doni, the obvious question. "Well, if you're not Jewish, where did you learn to speak Yiddish?" While crouching down to examine the damaged tire, he said, "I picked it up many years ago when I was hanging out with one of your buddies. You ever heard of Rav Yoel Teitelbaum, the Satmar Rebbe of Williamsburg?" I was shocked again, says Rav Doni, says the Rabbi Green. "You mean the great Hasidic master, the Rebbe of Satmar?" "Sure. Yeah, I heard of him," in disbelief. "The one and only," Donnie chuckled. He then went on to explain that he was a retired New York Police Department cop who on numerous occasions was assigned the duty of protecting the great Satmar Rebbe Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum. Now, not only was his job to protect him from outsiders, but his job was to protect from the insiders, from the throngs of Hasidim who wanted to get near the Rebbe. And Donnie was assigned to be his bodyguard, be it at home, in shul, or at public gatherings. And therefore, he would go incognito. He was told to dress up as he did on many occasions as a Satmar Chosid with a beard and payas and a bekasha. And his job was to scan the crowds to try to look at the same time as inconspicuous as possible. So Rabbi Green was puzzled. He said, "Tell me something. How were you able to tell whether someone was a genuine Satmar Chosid or whether they were an imposter?" He said, "Very simple." He says, "I figured that you guys always studying the Talmud, the Torah, you're always hunched over your books. And therefore," he said, "if I saw a man who was standing a little too straight, I kept my eye on him. He was either an impersonator or someone who wasn't taking his studies seriously." And he said to me, Donnie said, "Have you ever heard of the term a Yiddish cop?" I nodded my head, said Rabbi Green. So he said, if Jews are considered to be so smart and so clever, which is what a Yiddish cop is all about, then I have always been troubled, he said, by the following question. He said, "You see, I heard that you Jews used to live in Israel where you had a temple, a beautiful place where you all gather together for the holidays. Is that right, Rabbi?" "Yes," smiled Rabbi Green. "And he also," said Donnie, "I heard that around 2,000 years ago, you were exiled, your temple was destroyed, simply because you couldn't get along with one another. Is that correct?" The rabbi smiled and nodded his head again. "But," continued Donnie, "I also heard that if you guys could get along, then God would move you back to Jerusalem and he would rebuild your temple." Donnie then leaned towards the rabbi and looked him straight in the eyes. And he said to him, "So if you guys are so smart with your Yiddish cop, how comes in 2,000 years you haven't figured out how to get along?" The rabbi had no answer. And I think it proves an important point. Sometimes it takes a Latino ex-police officer to point out the obvious, and his message sadly still rings true. And that is, why haven't we figured out how to get along with one another? And I know what you're all thinking and what you're all saying. We get along. I've got my friends, I got my family, I get along. That's not what Donnie meant, and that's not what God means. It's easy to get along with those that are similar to yourselves. The challenge is when people are different to yourselves. How do you deal with that difference? They look different, they behave differently, they speak differently. How do we deal with that? Is it something that we're afraid of, we can't relate to, and therefore we run away? Or is it something that we can embrace and look for the similarities and look for what unites us. That, friends, is the key to us rebuilding our temple. It is a key to peace in the Middle East. It is a key to the redemption. If we actually want to get out of all the problems that we've got in the world, and as Jeremiah pointed out, all the problems, all the sorrows, everything comes from that lack of divine presence in those bricks and mortar, then we've got to do our part. And what's our part? Our part is that when we do see people that are different to ourselves, when we do see Jews in particular that are different to ourselves, it's ironic that sometimes we find it easier to get on with non-Jews than we do with our own. So when we do come across people that may be less religious or even more religious than ourselves, how do we greet them? How do we treat them? If we are able to use our Yiddisher kop, as Donnie said, and to be able to find ways and means to connect them, to make them feel that we're all one, then I can assure you, like Donnie said, with our Yiddisher kop, we'll be able to see a rebuilding of the temple, an end of the exile, and peace in our time. Wishing everyone well. See you tomorrow.